I'm Ryan Pryor. I'm a multimedia journalist and a social entrepreneur and an advocate for chronic fatigue syndrome.
I'm very interested in chronic fatigue syndrome because I deal with a lot of really severe chronic fatigue and no one has answers for me.
Hey there, and welcome to In Sickness and in Health, a podcast about our relationships with our bodies and issues at the intersections with chronic illness, disability, healthcare, and mortality. My name is Cara Gale. I'm not a doctor or a medical professional. I'm just a person and a patient and I guess a podcaster who really wants to talk about this stuff more. Nothing said on this show should ever be considered medical advice. If you're experiencing a medical issue, please seek qualified medical help. I know the system sucks, but I wish you a lot of luck. Every person is different, even within disease groups, so none of my guests should ever be regarded as official representatives or spokespersons for their conditions. Please respect their very personal choices, and unless they ask for it, please don't make suggestions about treatments or lifestyle changes. Unsolicited medical advice is never not annoying. In this episode, I talked to Ryan Pryor, co-director and producer of Forgotten Plague, a documentary about ME/CFS, or myalgic encephalomyelitis chronic fatigue syndrome. This conversation was recorded at the 2016 Stanford Medicine X conference in September, where Ryan and I were both e-patient delegates on the Storyteller track. And you can check out our Storyteller track projects in the show notes for this episode. We ran into each other in the MedX Studio tent, and I made him hold the microphone because my arm was tired. It's weird how much that changes the dynamic of an interview, and he actually wound up interviewing me a bit. We chatted about ME/CFS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, or POTS, how those two patient populations overlap, and some of the performative aspects of being a patient. I talked about living with and trying to manage POTS, quality of life, and try to answer the question posed by the MedX Studio Space of how to foster disruptive co-creation in healthcare. I decided to put this episode out now since October is Dysautonomia Awareness Month. If you're a longtime listener to the podcast, you might have heard the Dysautonomia series that we launched the show with last year. If not, go back and take a listen. I mean, you don't have to stop this episode and go do that. You can do it later. But I talked to 5 POTS patients with different primary diagnoses about their experiences living with this form of dysautonomia. I recorded episode 1 with Lauren Stiles, president of Dysautonomia International. She gave us a crash course in just what dysautonomia is and some of the fundraising and research grants that Dysautonomia International has been able to provide in this highly neglected field. Ryan and I got to talking because I was explaining to him that my own almost decade-long struggle with pretty severe chronic fatigue has me very interested in ME/CFS. Both ME/CFS and one of my diagnoses, POTS, share the common features of orthostatic intolerance and chronic fatigue. Orthostatic intolerance is, put simply, an increase in symptoms that comes on with assuming an upright position, so sitting or standing up, and are relieved upon recumbency, or laying down. It's associated with various forms of dysautonomia like POTS and is a key finding in ME/CFS. One of the other distinctive characteristics of ME/CFS is post-exertional fatigue or malaise. This is one of the things that makes the fatigue associated with the condition so much more than the generalized fatigue that comes with so many other chronic conditions. Many patients experience setbacks as the result of even really limited exertion, sometimes permanently. I experienced this. I had to quit physical therapy because of it. I know it is for real. It's totally unlike the generalized fatigue that I had for most of my life from some of my other chronic conditions until I got a weird viral illness that changed everything in 2007. I've had doctors bill with the diagnosis code for CFS just to get treatments covered, but I don't actually have it, which is fine, really. I don't need another poorly understood, often doubted, complex chronic condition on my medical records, which at this point read more like an ICD rap sheet than anything else. But so many of my other symptoms have their own diagnoses, and it's impossible to tell where one ends and the other begins, and if they're just all a part of a single continuum or discrete diagnoses. I guess it doesn't really matter, except that it does, because chronic fatigue is not taken seriously, and it is my biggest problem. If you're wondering how either of us managed to make it to MedX despite living with such fatigue and post-exertional malaise, I will tell you that it was not easy. I'm still recovering and have spent most of the last month in bed. Part of the reason that I was able to go at all was because I knew I would be able to spend this time that I needed to recover. I also had to fly in a few days early and fly out several days after the conference ended so I could recover. I had no idea going into it whether it would work, but it did, for the most part. There are still plenty more people with both of our conditions who could not even consider doing something like this due to their symptom burden. You can see what kind of devastation ME/CFS wreaks on the lives of those that live with it in Ryan's documentary, Forgotten Plague. The film also goes into issues with the condition's name, social stigma, and some of the reasons that it doesn't get the attention and research funding that it should. You can also hear Ryan on an episode of In Sickness and in Health, episode 7 guest Christopher Snyder's podcast, Just Talking. They talk more about the MedX experience and ME/CFS, and I'll link to that in the show notes for this episode. It's been a while since I put out a regular episode, and I've missed you all. My apologies for my long absence. I took the summer to let my brain rest, and obviously I've been recovering from MedX. But I'm ramping up production on the podcast again, and so there should be some more new episodes coming. I started the podcast last year with weekly episodes and then switched to an every other week schedule because it turns out single-handedly producing a weekly show is totally unsustainable. Who would have thought? Future episodes might be even less regular. I'm just going to put them out as I'm able to produce them, and I'm not sure what that might look like schedule-wise because I am still feeling pretty crappy. But something is better than nothing, right? If you're listening to this episode the week that it comes out, we'll actually be celebrating our first birthday next week, which is super exciting. Even though I wasn't able to actually produce episodes all the way through the year, I'm still really proud of what I've accomplished with the show so far, given what I deal with health-wise. So I am gonna celebrate somehow. I'm not sure how. We'll see. Thanks to my patrons over on Patreon for supporting the show on an ongoing basis. Stanford R., Laura, Katie, and Yarrow. Patreon enables me to accept small recurring donations on a per episode basis to help with the production costs of the podcast. If you haven't yet, check us out over on Patreon. Link in the show notes. There are different pledge levels that come with different rewards, and patrons who support the podcast also get access to the patron-only feed, on which I will be sharing some more behind-the-scenes stuff and sneak peeks at new episodes. Check out insicknesspod.com/donate for links to our Patreon and PayPal pages, including a video in which I describe exactly how Patreon works. Don't worry if you can't donate. The chronic life is expensive, and trust me, I totally understand that. You can also help out by taking a moment to subscribe, rate, and review us on iTunes or the Google Play Store, wherever you get your episodes. It helps other people find the show. Check out the episode page on insicknesspod.com for links to some of the stuff that we talk about in this episode, and find resources and more from us there. And as always, you can find us on social media at InSicknessPod. Find Ryan and his work online at rtprior.com. That's rtprior.com. His documentary, Forgotten Plague, is available on Amazon Prime, iTunes, Google Play, and DVD. Amazon Prime members can stream the documentary for free, and foreign audiences can find it on iTunes, where it is now available in 7 languages. Get the DVDs at Amazon.com or at ForgottenPlague.com. I just wanted to make a note before getting into this episode about some language that I used when we were talking about the performative aspects of being a patient. How I talk about it has way more to do with the perception of patients than what patients actually have to deal with to get adequate pain and symptom management. Ryan asked me how I avoid looking like a drug seeker, and I replied that I have made the conscious decision not to seek drugs. But not everybody has that choice, and the term drug seeker is pretty loaded, I guess I would say. To hear more about what chronic pain patients face in seeking treatment for severe chronic pain in the current climate around pain medication, take a listen to our episode 22 with Jen. She talked about needing regular opioid pain medication at a time when those medications are kind of public enemy number one. We discussed why she needs access to this medication, which, spoiler alert, it might have something to do with having her pelvis sawed in half twice. We talked about how we deal with drugs here in the U.S. and how that has created a climate in which we can't really have open and honest conversations about drug use, and how challenging it can be to really treat chronic pain. In that episode, we also discussed the important distinctions between addiction, abuse, and dependence, and the many trade-offs and compromises that we often have to make in treating chronic health conditions. For a taste of this issue from MedX, check out the Hurt blogger's post about her experience as a token patient on one of the conference panels about the opioid epidemic. She was also on Chris Snyder's Just Talking podcast, kind of debriefing about the experience, and I'll include a link to that on the episode page as well. So I hope you enjoyed this episode.
Technically meet the diagnostic criteria, except for the one that's like, unless it can be explained by another cause. And I have another cause that kind of explains it.
What's your other cause?
Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, which is often associated with chronic fatigue syndrome as well. So,
POTS is very similar and very frustrating, and lots of people that I know have that, and then. Yeah, it's very stupid if you have that diagnosis and then you get excluded from what might be your actual primary diagnosis.
Right. In my case, I have a primary diagnosis, but I have so many secondary diagnoses that it kind of makes the primary diagnosis not even really my worst issue, which confuses a lot of doctors.
Yeah, so my foundation that I run, we're really interested in, our vision is to kind of create a world in which all medical students are being educated about ME/CFS, and so right now only about 5% of U.S. medical students are educated about it. So I'm going to be going to as many of the education panels as possible, and particularly when people give talks or panels about how they've changed the medical school curriculum in a certain category. I'll be going and hearing about that, and then probably picking the brain of people afterwards and kind of getting some ideas on how we should change what we're doing. Right now we have a fellowship program, and we've changed through doing this fellowship program with a few medical students at Nova Southeastern University. We changed the curriculum in that one medical school, but we want to try to do that in every school.
Yeah, so they don't teach chronic fatigue syndrome very well, if at all, in medical school. What kind of resistance or ignorance have you run into with doctors that you've seen yourself?
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of it comes down to the fact that it's hard to diagnose, and so it's kind of, most people who do know at least something about it think about it as a diagnosis of exclusion. I mean, most doctors who know about it think of it as a diagnosis of exclusion, so you have to exclude every other disease before you actually give it this diagnosis, when in reality it should be like any other disease, that you diagnose it with a simple blood test or a simple MRI or CAT scan. Plenty of evidence in the medical literature about what a CFS brain looks like. Plenty of different immunological markers of what a CFS blood looks like. And so all those things need to be kind of operationalized and mainstreamed so that any doctor's office can perform those tests, and probably more importantly, interpret those tests to know what the key signature of the disease looks like. I think the literature is there and the research is there. It's just a matter of, and many of the government committees and such have recommended that some of these things be put in practice, but it just hasn't quite happened yet. So that's kind of a lot of where we are with the advocacy community. And so our foundation, the Blueprint Foundation, kind of helps put those into practice.
Cool. Did you have a hard time getting diagnosed?
It took me 6 months, which seemed very hard at the time, but from people who I've interviewed, that's very extremely fast. And 3, 5, or 10 years would be not at all surprising when I interview people. And I mean, after probably interviewed over 100 patients on film, and I've talked to several hundred and read the stories of several thousand, and most people they write letters to us and they'll say, Dear Ryan, or Dear Forgotten Plague team, my name is so-and-so. I've been sick for 25 years, and I was diagnosed in 1989, and I've been disabled ever since. And so those are the kind of the basic.
Do you see any disparity in diagnosis time? Like, obviously you haven't done any formalized study of this, but do you see, when you talk to patients, any disparity between the genders as far as time to diagnosis?
Yeah, there is a belief that women, I think it is true that women get this more commonly than men, and that does play into some role. So, like, I was a 17-year-old male athlete, and so there's a reluctance on the part of the doctors to diagnose it because they think of it as something that middle-aged women get. I've interviewed tons of many young male athletes and bodybuilders and army people, and so that is not a true thing to say that middle-aged women are the. I mean, maybe they get it more often than other people, but there's no shortage of young men who also get it.
Right. Now, I believe this is also true of chronic fatigue syndrome with POTS. A lot of physicians believe that it is simply the result of deconditioning. Did you get that sort of pushback from your doctors?
Yeah, I was an active athlete, and I was probably more in the category of working out way too much, and so I couldn't have been deconditioned. But there is I personally didn't get that, but it's like half the time I'm telling my story, half the time I'm telling the stories of hundreds of other, thousands of people that I'm aware of. But there's a common trend in the stories that we hear that people are, that it's a combination of depression and deconditioning. And so how do you, and then there's a belief that if they're deconditioned and depressed, that they should be doing this graded exercise therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy to fix it. And cognitive behavioral therapy is maybe helpful for some small portion of the illness, but and graded exercise therapy, I would say, is completely counterproductive, and it probably harms dramatically more people than it helps with CFS. Mm-hmm. Would you?
I would agree. Well, with POTS, it's a little bit different because people have POTS for a variety of different reasons. So I have POTS because of a genetic disorder that's no amount of exercising is going to make me feel better. Well, that I would not. I guess what I'm trying to say is that there's some evidence that when you have the onset of POTS is pretty significant to your prognosis. It seems that if it comes on during your teen years, a certain amount of those people actually do have resolution of their symptoms in adulthood. For those of us who have had symptoms our whole life, or it comes on at a different point, that does not seem to be the case, but we still need a lot more research for that. I forget why I was saying that.
Oh, I'm curious that, especially for people who don't really understand what POTS is, I'm also curious that I had a friend, for instance, that she couldn't really stand up for more than about 5 minutes before she would faint, and so it would be in situations where she would be trying to do something social, she'd get really excited, she'd see somebody she wanted to talk to, go run over and talk to them, and then get in a great conversation, and within 5 minutes she might faint. Has that been something that you've experienced?
I am fortunate. Actually, the majority of POTS patients don't faint. That is a misconception that a lot of doctors even have, and I know people that have been told, if you've never fainted, then you can't possibly have POTS. And that's just not true. Generally, the only times that I actually experience full syncope, which is like a full fainting episode, is if I have an infection. So if I have the flu or a cold or something, one of the first signs that I'm what I call regular people sick on top of my chronic illness is if I faint or have like a really near fainting episode. So most of what I experience is pre-syncope. If I'm standing up for 5 minutes or so, then I'll start to get like things will start to get kind of gray and I'll get like cotton ball brain, what I call it. And I get enough of a warning that I can sit down. Plenty of POTS patients actually have multiple forms of dysautonomia, and POTS is a form of dysautonomia. So I have POTS and inappropriate sinus tachycardia. So I'm getting off on a tangent. Some people also have neurocardiogenic syncope, which is another form of dysautonomia. And that's where the fainting often comes from. They have an overlap of those two syndromes. So
what's the best way for you to manage it or to treat it, or any hope of actually curing it?
Not at the moment. Like I said, it depends. Some people do have a full resolution of symptoms. I don't. I've had this my whole life, and I know it's really not going away. So I'm not, holding out hope for a cure. So everyone is different. Like I said, people have POTS for different reasons. So generally speaking, if the underlying cause is something that's treatable, you want to treat the underlying cause. Because then, so for example, some portion of POTS patients have it because they have primary Sjogren's, which is an autoimmune disorder. So if that is treated and treated effectively, that some patients actually experience a resolution of, or at least an improvement of their symptoms. In general, though, there's no FDA-approved treatment specifically for POTS, so it's a lot of off-label prescribing. The first recommendations that we get are increased sodium and fluids to augment the blood volume, retain more fluid, which is helpful, but it's certainly not a cure. Compression stockings, I'm wearing waist-high compression stockings today. That also can help. And then medication-wise, it's usually some combination of beta blockers for the tachycardia, although that can also cause problems with the blood pressure. And then other things like Mitidrin, which I forget what that is actually used for specifically. But that, I guess, causes peripheral vasoconstriction, so there's not as much blood pooling. Also, Mestinon, which is generally prescribed for an autoimmune disease called myasthenia gravis that affects the muscles. And sometimes SSRIs, although every time I've been on an SSRI, it has ended very poorly for me and my POTS. That's another, actually, thing that makes me pass out, is if I'm on an SSRI. But some people do well on them. So it's a lot of trial and error, which can be really frustrating. And it's another condition that kind of exists outside of anyone's specific specialty. Obviously, the tachycardia is the thing that's measurable and the diagnostic handle for that syndrome, but it's so much more than just your heart rate. And so because it's that tachycardia, a lot of doctors think like, oh, this is a cardiac issue, but really it's more of a neurological issue. It's an issue with an autonomic nervous system. But autonomic neurologists are very few and far between. I live 30 minutes north of New York City and I can't really find a doctor. So it's frustrating because kind of no one wants to take responsibility for us. We're very complicated patients. It's just, it's frustrating because I'm not getting enough blood to my brain most of the time, and it makes me feel stupid right now. But yeah.
I was just remembering when one of the doctors that we interviewed for our film, and was treating a lot of people with CFS, which was, translates to treating a lot of people with POTS. And one of the things that she had these chairs in the back, and there was like kind of like lazy boy chairs where you had like a footrest the footrest would pop up.
Yeah.
And she talked about how she would be talking to patients who were sitting in a regular chair, and their brain fog would come in and after very, very fast. And she said that if you just simply gave the person Gatorade, which helped with the electrolytes, helped with the blood volume, and then also put their legs up and on the footrest, she could increase the amount of attention that the patient had in the actual appointment by, you could extend the appointment 30 minutes, and you could actually get a lot more done with the people.
Yeah, so there's a doctor at New York Medical College named Julian Stewart who has done a lot of the research on POTS. He's one of, the very few research teams that are actually looking at this, and he's looked at cerebral perfusion, so the amount of blood that actually is getting to the brains of POTS patients, and found that patients in the study did experience cerebral hypoperfusion after a certain period of time on a tilt table test. So that's where they strap you to a table and they tilt you upwards, and that's generally what's used to diagnose POTS, but it's also used in a lot of the studies because it's a kind of controllable way to induce the symptoms. So what he's done is actually taken ultrasounds, like cranial ultrasounds of the patients, and measured the amount of blood that's getting to their brain, and found that while tilted upright, POTS patients generally aren't getting as much blood to their brain. So that does explain, the brain fog and the fatigue and the cotton ball brain. And definitely I can tell, like the way that a lot of people with diabetes can tell if their blood sugar is low, I can tell it feels very similar to having low blood sugar. So I will either eat salty snack or pour some salt in my mouth and then chug a bunch of water, which is always really weird to do in public. But it's definitely, like, you can feel the difference. You're not going to have a resolution of those symptoms. But it can definitely make a difference for sure.
So if you were a bagel, would you be a salty bagel? Is that kind of where we started off?
Yeah, exactly.
Or do you wish you were a salty bagel, but you're not?
I think I am a salty bagel. I am. I mean, salty in the way that I'm like kind of cranky a lot. Okay. But then also I do, my salt needs are kind of ridiculous.
And when you say cotton ball brain, what does that mean? Is that the same thing as brain fog? But I've never heard people use that term before.
Yeah, it's something. It's my own term. It's not a clinical term. The way that I can describe it is just it's more of a physical feeling than brain fog is. I mean, brain fog can be a very physical feeling, but it's more of the cognitive effects that you're experiencing, whereas cotton ball brain just feels like I have cotton balls instead of a brain. It's all kind of like dried out and weird. I don't know. It's so hard to explain. But yeah, I don't know.
So, and so you said you're a full-time patient now. Do you plan to have a specific career in the long run, where podcasting could be that career?
Maybe. I mean, right now, actually, I am in the process of appealing my disability claim, which has been a delight, or the exact opposite.
How many times have you applied for disability?
Just once, and I only just filed my appeal. So I've filed once, I've gotten one rejection, and I've filed an appeal, and I'm waiting to hear on that decision. Who knows? I'm hoping that, like, I don't have to be on disability for the rest of my life. I would love more than anything to work. I would love to, there's so many, I had to put the podcast on hiatus because I was just dealing with more health stuff and wasn't able to make the show that I wanted to make. And there's so much more that I want to do with it, and there's so many other things that are so cool that I want to do. So I am hoping that at some point I find the right combination of medications and lifestyle changes and whatever that will enable me to work again. But at this point, that doesn't seem like it's going to happen anytime soon. So I'm just hanging in there.
And do you think the disability request that you sent will get eventually approved? And do you have other people that you know with POTS who've filed similar requests and have gotten them to work, or have not gotten them to work?
I mean, POTS is difficult because it's not one of the Blue Book conditions. They have a certain number of conditions that, like, it's like, oh, you have this, so of course you get disability. And it is not a rare condition, but it is rarely diagnosed. So a lot of I imagine that a lot of people who are looking at my case and reviewing my case are not familiar with it, and that's frustrating. I do know POTS patients that have filed successful claims. I don't know if mine will be successful. I'm not particularly hopeful about it. It shouldn't be the case, but I always have to do this kind of like song and dance of I'm not a drug seeker and I'm a very engaged patient and I really know a lot and I know my body and you should probably listen to me when I tell you things because I live here, so.
How do you prove that you're not a drug seeker when you go into an office? I know that, for instance, when I was doing it, we would go in, and my dad was in the military at the time, and oftentimes he wore his military uniform, and then my mom was there also, and then I would always come in and wear a tie sometimes, and my mom was a nurse, and so she understood the medical system backwards and forwards, and so she could, sort of call out any doctor on anything they had, and any sort of back talk. I mean, I don't want to say that back talk from the doctors, how dare they? But but any sort of like doubts that doctors had. I had a parent who was a nurse and a parent who was a military officer, and another one and then me kind of, sometimes I was, wearing a suit almost just to kind of prove that we were not there, like, messing around.
Right. Yeah. It's really frustrating. There's this whole performative aspect of being a patient. I mean, for me, I've made the choice not to seek drugs, even if, opioids are this huge issue right now. I might benefit from judicious use of opioids on my really bad pain days. It would really help if I had, something to take. But I've decided, just not even to bring it up with my doctors because it's not worth the energy that I'll have to spend first convincing them that might be of a benefit to me, then the energy that's required to go back every month and get your prescription and then bring it to the pharmacy and deal with people at the pharmacy thinking that you're a drug seeker. So I've stayed away from opioids. So that helps. But then, there's just all of these assumptions that doctors have about patients that we're lying to them. And some people do, but for me, I go in with notes every single time, just so that I don't forget what I'm talking about, as I am often one to do.
Right, and having the notes.
Right. Yeah, that definitely helps. But then also the fact that I know my shit helps a lot too. But it takes a while for them to accept that I also have knowledge, and insight. And that just because I don't have a bunch of acronyms after my name doesn't mean that I looked something up on Google for 10 minutes and decided that this is just what I have. This has gotten dramatically easier now that I have actual diagnoses. I was seeing doctors for 20 years who were telling me that I was crazy. The fact that I have diagnoses and I have medical records and I can be like, look at this paper. This other person with acronyms after their name said I have this, so you have to believe me. So that helps. And just going in and having a goal for each what are those things called? Appointment. That helps, just having the illusion that I have my shit together, really, which is annoying because I am a sick person and I don't necessarily have my shit together always. And I most recently have been dealing with a lot of chronic migraines, which limits my cognitive ability and my ability to pretend that I have my shit together and be nice and friendly and whatever. And I had to go see a new neurologist in the process to deal with this. So it's always really nerve-wracking to me going into any doctor's appointment, but especially new ones. So it's just a matter of controlling for all of the factors that I can and then hoping for the best as far as the other factors that I don't have control over.
And I'm just thinking a lot of the patients I know in my community, and I assume this is exactly with every other disease community, is that everyone's hyper literate in reading the medical literature, and they know who is the co-author on which particular studies and how is the patient cohort designed and what were the methodologies used in a particular study, and they'll call out certain universities who don't design good studies, and they know to discount certain studies, and they can bring in the right studies to their particular doctor's visits. And I kind of feel as though like if you just have like a simple like a high school education, you're almost capable of understanding most things that are published in medical journals, and it's much less of a esoteric field than a lot of people realize.
Well, doctors like to maintain that air of mysteriousness, and it's something that I really struggle with, because it's like, okay, I guess we have to do this your way, and kind of like a lot of doctors like don't have an understanding of how studies are designed and just and how small a lot of the sample sizes are. And it really is surprising to me sometimes where I'll be like, actually, and then they'll be like, I had no idea about that. I saw a GI doctor last year for some mild gastroparesis symptoms that I was having, and she told me that I couldn't possibly be having those because I didn't have diabetes. But according to the American College of Gastroenterology, only 20% of people with gastroparesis have gastroparesis because of diabetes. I have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome is a connective tissue disorder, and anything that you read about gastroparesis is like causes are diabetes, some other things, and connective tissue disorders. So like, and there are studies in the EDS community and in the POTS community, although there is a lot of overlap there, but in those two separate groups of people, that rates of gastroparesis are higher than the general population.
And where did she get that information? Was that something that she learned in medical school like decades ago that wasn't accurate anymore?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, and that's been really frustrating too. EDS is taught, if they teach it at all, it's 10 minutes in a pathology class at some point. They say, this is Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, here's all the types, here's a bunch of symptoms, but we're not going to break it out by type for you, and here are a bunch of pictures that are really extreme examples of the physical manifestations. So what I hear from EDS patients all the time is, I went to the doctor and asked them about EDS, and they told me that I couldn't possibly have it because I don't have stretchy skin, or I don't have blue sclera in my eyes, or I don't have this, or I don't have that. But different types of EDS have different symptoms that correlate to them. And doctors are not educated on it at all, and it's so frustrating because every doctor that I see, with the exception of my rheumatologist that diagnosed me, every doctor I see, I know more about my diseases than they do.
Is there a doctor somewhere in the U.S. that it would like your dream doctor who would actually you could go to who actually does understand better than you?
Yeah, I mean, there definitely are some doctors. The formerly Ehlers-Danlos National Foundation, now the Ehlers-Danlos Society, funded a center of excellence, or like one of those things in Baltimore. So there's a handful of doctors down there who are leading researchers in the field who are know it inside and out and all the different types. But when it comes down to it, I just need someone who will work with me. The manifestations of EDS are highly variable by person, highly variable by type, and we just need people who will believe us, first of all, step one. And then step two, work with us based on our symptoms to help us manage our quality of life. Because that is not a priority for any of the doctors that I've seen. And that's so frustrating because that's my priority. Like, I know I'm not going to have a cure. I know that, my quality of life as it is right now is below an acceptable level to me, and none of my doctors gave a shit, and none of them were like, okay, let's figure out how to improve this quality of life. I actually just talked to a palliative care doctor yesterday evening, and we briefly talked about the potential for palliative care in the setting of chronic disease management, because it's more about your quality of life than it is about helping you pass over to the other side or whatever it is. People have a lot of misconceptions about palliative care. It's different than hospice care. And palliative care physicians are adept in symptom management, and then also they generally work with kind of holistic care teams. So there's actual care coordination. There's generally a social worker, a nurse, a doctor, and then they liaise with your other physicians to, help you manage your condition, and make you as comfortable as possible. And that's what I need. That's what I need more than anything else. And I'm not getting that. And our system is not set up for that at all.
And the people that you're seeing, the doctors, their goals are to, provide a service, prescribe a drug, do what they do, and then have you be gone and taken care of.
Yeah, I mean, it's unfair of me to say that they don't give a shit. That is not fair. But
they have different institutional incentives that don't necessarily mean what is your idea of human flourishing. Essentially, they want to provide whatever it means to be a good employee in the hospital system.
Yeah, and they're dealing with a lot. Our healthcare system is in flux right now. It's never been super great for people with chronic conditions. Primary care doctors especially have really unreasonable demands placed on them generally by their employers, the amount of patients that they need to see in a day and the amount of time that they get with us. Funny enough, I actually worked for Apple in one of their retail stores for several years, and, taking customers on an appointment basis, whether I was doing personal training or Genius Bar work, that is brutal. Having to turn someone around every 10 to 15 minutes or every 50 minutes in the case of personal training, that's really hard because people show up late. They have more complex problems than the time allotted. And so I have a tremendous amount of empathy for the challenges of working on an appointment basis, and, reimbursements from insurance companies don't match, especially for people with complex chronic conditions, don't match the amount of time that physicians need to spend with their patients. Or even if it's not spending time with their patients, researching to, help them manage their conditions. So it's definitely not their fault, and I don't fault them for it. And I do understand a lot. Having friends that are doctors has helped a lot, because we can kind of they can talk about their experience, I can talk about my experience. It was very healing kind of for both of us to hear either side of the story. But all of that being said, the way that our system is set up and the way that medical education is set up and conducted is failing all of us, not just the patients, but the doctors as well. Possibly even the insurance companies, although I don't have a tremendous amount of empathy for them, or the pharmaceutical companies, although thanks for the drugs.
Do you have an idea for this? So we're here in this Stanford, disruptive co-creation, studio, this MedX Studio. What would your idea for disruptive co-creation be to fix some of these issues and kind of have a better link between doctors and patients?
I mean, I think at least part of this should start with medical education and with getting students face time with complex patients much earlier in their training. I'm talking from year one, they should have complex patients come and talk to students. I did Columbia Medical School has a program in a field called narrative medicine, which is really the intersection of everything that I am interested in. So I did a week-long workshop with some medical students last year, and my presence there, I got feedback that it was really helpful for a lot of the students who conceived of chronic disease as heart disease, diabetes, and maybe chronic kidney disease, and not a whole lot beyond that. They get so much about heart, and of course, heart disease and diabetes are huge issues. They affect tons of people, but 1 in 10 Americans lives with a rare disease or disorder. 1 in 2 American adults live with chronic health condition. And yes, plenty of those are heart disease and diabetes, but there are more people living with autoimmune disease than there are people living with heart disease and diabetes. And yet, because this is an opinion that may or may not be backed by evidence. But I think that because autoimmune disease disproportionately affects women, and that's why it's really like not that big of a deal. Like no one cares, it doesn't get the research funding. It's not sexy, and something that I found doing my podcast is that women are systematically shut out of the healthcare system. Not just women, certainly people of color, these are all generalizations, but
people who are not straight white men are going to have any number of things that they don't fit the classic model of what medicine is designed to help.
But doing my podcast, the diagnosis stories that I get from women versus the diagnosis stories that I get from men are pretty different. Like it took you 6 months to get diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome.
Yeah, with extensive parental help, with extensive financial involvement, with
which is
going to so many doctors in very, very rapid succession.
Right, yeah. And the economics of all of this is like a whole other issue, and the geography of it even. People in rural areas obviously don't get the care that they need. But women are routinely denied care and routinely denied their experience. And as a result, we wind up getting so much sicker before we actually get any help. And, as far as rising costs of healthcare goes, there's a lot of talk about preventative care, and that's important. But what about believing people when they tell you there's something wrong with them? Because we talk about these epidemics of heart disease and diabetes, but we don't talk about epidemics of women and people of color being denied the care that they need. Before I had to get so sick before anyone would take me seriously, and that is unacceptable. So I think that getting patients and providers mingled in spaces that aren't just the clinical environment, where we can connect on a human level and share in our humanity and remember that you're just a person and I'm just a person, and we're all just trying to figure this out together, and we're all going to die someday. So maybe we should talk about that while we're at it, because that's a whole other thing that I'm kind of obsessed with. But it's about getting people together and reminding them that we are the same. We have plenty of differences, but when it comes down to it, we're all just humans, and the acronyms at the end of your last name, they're important. I respect them. You spent a lot of money to get them, but that doesn't discount my entire experience and my knowledge, I guess. I don't know.
And I'm just thinking, to kind of unify that idea with, the medical system as it currently is, because I think most of these, autoimmune disorders or complex diseases are marked by specific markers in the bloodstream, or marked by specific, tests that can be done. If the research was there to get the patient cohort that could then, isolate that specific thing, and then we could design a test that could make those things easily diagnosable in the first or second doctor's visit. And so I think make people aware of all these things, that this problem exists, but then the system can bend, can stay the same to a degree, but it should bend to help these people who need, more attention to these areas that haven't been fully covered yet.
Yeah, for sure. And, in the case of POTS, Dysautonomia International has funded a few studies now that is showing more of their cohorts with autoimmune markers that just weren't being tested for before. Muscarinic antibodies and a few other things that aren't generally part of an autoimmune panel. And another thing that's important to note is that a lot of these tests for biomarkers have a certain, amount of sensitivity, and it depends on at what point in the progression of the disease you're testing as to whether or not they'll show up. Sjogren's is a really good example where you can test for the SSA and SSB antibodies, and I think it only catches 30 or 40% of Sjogren's diagnoses, and definitely not for people who have had it. And I think after a certain period of time, they kind of disappear too. So that those tests are not helpful. There are more tests being developed, but of course newer tests often aren't covered by insurance and are cost prohibitive. I know that this is all about getting together different stakeholders in medicine and providing value-based care, but when it comes down to it, I think that the fundamental flaw in our medical system is the fact that it's for profit. There's so many problems that stem. It's not the only problem. We have a lot of problems, but there's so many problems that stem from that. I think that the future of value-based medicine is maybe a losing premise.
I like your idea of the for disruptive co-creation was this like narrative medicine program at Columbia. Is that something that's is there like a graduate degree program in that, or is that a recurring workshop, or like what all is going on with that program?
Yeah, so
how would people get involved with that?
You can go to narrativemedicine.org, I think, is their website. They offer a master's degree in it, a master's of science, which if I ever have the energy to go back to school, I might do. But they do offer workshops for students, medical students, and students in any health-related field. Every summer they do the week-long Summer Institute in Narrative Medicine, which is what I did, which is so worth it. It's one of the best things I've ever done. And they also provide workshops for practitioners. So those are way more expensive because they're for like practicing doctors who have a lot more money. And those are generally on the weekends. They do one that kind of like intro to narrative medicine, and then another one that is an advanced narrative medicine course. And I think a third one about narrative ethics, which don't ask me to explain what that is. And there are narrative medicine programs popping up in all over the place. So Sophie Davis School of Biomedical Education in New York City also has one for their undergraduate medical students. I think some university in Virginia has a program. So this is something that's gaining traction. It's part of like the larger movement to incorporate the arts and humanities into medicine and medical practice. That's like a larger trend that's happening. That's definitely some like what's happening in this tent here. So I think that there's something to that. I during our small group sessions in that workshop all week, the medical students were talking about objectively knowing things, that like objectively this and quantitatively that, blah, blah, blah. And as a person who has a background in the arts, who went to art school, we were taught there is no such thing as objectivity. And yet they're taught the exact opposite. And I think that the truth exists somewhere in between those two things. So anytime that we can like get people from different disciplines mingling together and sharing ideas and co-creatively disrupting things, I think it's a good start. We're not going to fix our healthcare system tomorrow. It's been broken forever, basically. I have talked to people all over the world for my podcast, either on the show or just, people who email me. And, it's not working anywhere. I think it's really difficult to provide people with quality care, especially in a larger country like the US or Canada. It's administratively a nightmare. And so it's been broken for a long time. It's going to take a long time to fix it. I don't know if there are any fixes, but I think that things like the narrative medicine program and things like Medicine X are a good place to start, for sure. Yeah.
This was great. Yeah, I'm trying to think of anything. I think we nailed it. Yeah.
We did nail it. Thank you
for letting me come on your podcast.
Yeah, my podcast arm is tired, so thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of In Sickness and in Health. Check out the episode page for links to some of the stuff that we talk about. And you can find resources and more from us at insicknesspod.com and on social media at insicknesspod. Find Ryan and his work online at rtpryor.com. And if you haven't yet, watch his documentary, Forgotten Plague, which is available on Amazon Prime, iTunes, Google Play, and DVD. And don't forget to be excellent to yourselves and each other.